Well, one of the biggest questions facing workers right now is this. If the economy is doing so well, why does it feel so difficult just to get ahead? It's a question that comes up again and again whenever politicians, economists, and working people talk about the economy. The numbers on paper often tell one story, people's lived experiences tell another. That disconnect was on display recently when White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett pushed back on concerns about inflation and energy prices.
Are you concerned about that disconnect that we saw there between the stock market is on fire, hitting new records every week, it seems, and Americans struggling with high gas prices, high inflation?
Well, I think that the report that we just listened to did put its finger on the scale of negativity, ignoring a lot of really positive news. But for sure, gas prices are high. They're not quite as high as they were peak under Joe Biden, but they're high. And a lot of other things are going down. But, you know, one of the things I've noticed here at the White House is whatever piece of consumer price that is looking like it's a little bit disappointing is the only thing we talk about. So you guys, the first month that I came here, the only thing you want to talk about was egg prices because they were high because of the avian flu. Egg prices are down 85%. What you need to do is smooth through the ups and downs, look at what's happening to real wages. And that was actually a factual error in the report because I actually printed out the latest real wage numbers here. But if you look at it, because there are more people working and because the stock market's booming, profits are high, and that's feeding through into wages, salaries, or worker salaries, that we've got like the typical manufacturing worker. So far, their real income adjusted for inflation is up $2,268. For a manufacturing worker, it's $3,000. For a mining worker, it's $4,500. And so on balance, real incomes, real wages are going up.
But are you saying the Americans are not hurting? I mean, we're hearing that not just, a whole bunch of different economic indicators, but just talking to people. I mean, people seem anxious and uneasy about the economy, don't they?
Well, look, in the end, people look at their wallets and they decide how to vote. And if they look at their wallets and look at how much money they have after, the increase in prices, they're going to find that they have a lot more money. And the one other thing I could say is that the consumer sentiment index that was cited is a Michigan survey that's extremely partisan. I talked about this on TV last week, that basically when Joe Biden was there, the Democrats in the survey, they were euphoric. Their index was way above 100% during stagflation. Right now, it's the lowest on record, something like 30%. And so when you say that American consumers are really down in the dumps, what it is Democrats are in the dumps. Republicans have actually stayed around 80% on that survey all the way through. And so there's another measure, consumer confidence, which the Conference Board puts out, which is about an all-time high. So if we're going to say, oh, Americans are this or Americans are that, we should at least truthfully look at the data and think about what the different signals are from the different data.
So I know you're hoping that there's going to be a deal to reopen the strait, and maybe that'll come really soon. We've been hearing for a while that it's coming soon, but maybe it's going to happen soon. But let me ask you, if it doesn't happen, if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed and those tankers aren't getting bad, what do you think happens to gas prices and oil prices?
Well, what's going on, I think that you would agree, is that oil and gas prices have surprised by not being nearly as high as a lot of people forecasted, because in part people have found ways to adjust. There's a big pipeline in Saudi Arabia that's piping out more oil without having to go through the Gulf.
Right.
And that kind of adjustment has made it so that the price hasn't gone to the 150s or the 200s that some people forecasted. I expect that the way to think about it is when we get the straits open, and now there is actually a lot more traffic going through the straits than there was 2 weeks ago. When you get the straits open, then it's about 300 nautical miles per day for one of those big tankers. And so the people in Pakistan and India that have refineries that are mostly shut down are going to get their oil. They'll turn the refineries up, and then refined product prices will go down globally, and then it'll spread from place to place. But really, it's like a month or two until everything gets back to the refineries.
That's if the strait reopens, and actually the International Energy Agency said it could take several months before the flow really gets going and prices come down. But the ExxonMobil senior vice president, Neil Chapman, I'm sure you saw what he said to investors on a conference call this week. He said, we're approaching unheard of inventory levels. I mean, really, really low levels. You can debate whether it's going to hit those really low levels in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but once you get to that point, you'll see the price shoot up. So, I mean, the concern here is, I'm sure you must share it, that if a deal isn't struck, we could actually see those significantly higher levels of not just oil prices, but of course, gas prices.
Right. Well, we track inventories every day. We started out with billions of barrels of private and government inventories, and we still are in the billions. And so there's plenty of runway, but also, there's a lot of pressure on Iran to finally agree to the president's terms. One way to think about it is that if you look at the rial, half a dozen years ago, then 4,000 of them would buy $1. Right now, it's something like 1.4 million of them buys $1.
The Iranian currency. Well, their inflation is higher than ours.
But it also puts a lot of pressure on them. Like the people on fixed incomes and so on are really suffering.
Now, if you're filling up your gas tank every week, paying a mortgage, buying groceries, or trying to save money for a down payment on a home, that's certainly welcome news. Nobody wants higher gas prices. Nobody wants inflation. But workers have heard promises about relief before. And that's where the broader economic picture becomes important. This week, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, issued a stark warning about the global economy. The organization warned that if disruptions in Middle Eastern energy supplies continue, global growth could slow dramatically while inflation rises. In a worst-case scenario, growth could fall to levels associated with major economic crises, while workers across many countries face declining real wages and higher costs of living. Think about that for a moment. The concern isn't simply that gas becomes more expensive. Higher energy costs ripple through the entire economy. Transportation becomes more expensive. Manufacturing becomes more expensive. Shipping becomes more expensive. Food production becomes more expensive. Eventually, those costs show up in the prices workers pay every day. In fact, recent reports from the Federal Reserve's regional survey suggest exactly that is happening. Businesses have reported rising costs tied to energy prices, and those increases are spreading into groceries, packaging, transportation, and other everyday goods. Consumers are responding by cutting back on discretionary spending and relying more heavily on credit. And this is where the conversation often gets lost. When economists talk about inflation, they're usually discussing percentages. Workers experience inflation as choices. Can I afford to take my family on vacation? Can I replace my aging vehicle? Can I put money into savings this month? Can I afford a home? Can I afford to have children? Can I afford to retire someday? Those are the questions people ask themselves. And increasingly, younger Americans are finding that the answer to many of those questions is no. A recent report from The Guardian highlighted what many younger workers already know firsthand. The traditional milestones of adulthood are becoming harder and harder to achieve. Financial independence, home ownership, marriage, starting a family, and building long-term savings all feel increasingly out of reach for many people under 40. Many are working full-time jobs. Many have college degrees. Many followed the exact advice they were given growing up. Go to school, work hard, build a career, be responsible. Yet despite doing everything right, they're finding themselves squeezed by housing costs, student debt, healthcare expenses, childcare costs, and everyday living expenses. For previous generations, moving out of your parents' house and establishing financial independence was often viewed as a normal stage of adulthood. Today, millions of young adults are delaying that transition or returning home because rents and housing prices have simply outpaced their incomes. And this isn't just a personal problem, it's an economic problem. When young adults can't afford homes, home sales suffer. When workers can't afford childcare, labor force participation suffers. When families delay having children because of financial concerns, demographic challenges grow. When workers spend larger portions of their income on necessities, local businesses suffer because consumers have less discretionary spending available. In other words, affordability isn't separate from the economy. Affordability is the economy. That's why so many workers feel frustrated when they're told the economy is strong. They look around and see record housing prices. They see rents consuming enormous portions of paychecks. They see healthcare costs continuing to climb. They see grocery bills that remain substantially higher than they were just a few years ago. And now they're hearing warnings that global economic growth could slow while inflation remains elevated because of energy market disruptions overseas. For workers, this creates a sense of economic whiplash. One day they're told inflation is under control. The next day they're told new geopolitical events could push prices higher. One day they're told the labor market is strong. The next day they're reading stories about college graduates struggling to find jobs and young workers delaying major life decisions because they can't afford them. The reality is that people don't judge the economy by GDP growth. They don't judge it by stock market performance. They don't judge it by what economists predict might happen 6 months from now. They judge it by whether they can build a decent life through their work. Can they pay their bills? Can they buy a home? Can they raise a family? Can they save for retirement? Can they achieve a level of economic security that previous generations often took for granted? Those are the measures that matter. And until more workers can answer yes to those questions, there will continue to be a massive disconnect between what economic statistics suggest and what people experience in their everyday lives. Because at the end of the day, workers don't live inside economic forecasts. They live inside the economy itself. In a piece in The Guardian by labor reporter Michael Sainato, Where are the Jobs? As U.S. auto workers face offshoring, Democrats vie to win votes, examines the growing frustration among Midwestern auto workers who have watched manufacturing jobs disappear through offshoring and trade policies, while politicians from both parties have promised revivals that many workers say never materialized. Through a series of town halls organized by labor groups and consumer advocates, current and retired workers from Ohio and Michigan describe the long-term impact of factory closures, production moving overseas, and uncertainty surrounding tariffs and trade agreements. Workers repeatedly express concern that younger generations will not have access to the same stable, unionized careers that once supported entire communities. Several workers shared personal stories about the decline of manufacturing employment. Morgan Hughes, an auto worker in Ohio, noted that production has increasingly shifted to Mexico because, quote, labor outside of the U.S. is so much cheaper, while describing how tariffs and trade disruptions have contributed to uncertainty at her plant. Retired Ford worker Janice Williams said offshoring has taken away opportunities that families hope to pass down through generations, arguing that politicians increasingly fail to represent working class people. Reflecting on the future, she asked, quote, where are we going to be in the next 5 years? Where are the jobs going to be? The article also highlights criticism of trade agreements such as NAFTA from both labor activists and progressive Democrats. At one town hall, Representative Rashida Tlaib argued that NAFTA-style trade deals have failed working families, describing them as part of a global race to the bottom that harmed workers while increasing inequality. The piece notes that the Midwest lost more than 1 million manufacturing jobs between 1990 and 2019, and that hundreds of thousands of jobs were officially certified as lost due to NAFTA, though some experts believe the true number is higher. Retired workers emphasize the value of union jobs and the retirement security they once provided. Former GM worker Gail Alashir says she feels fortunate to have a strong pension and health care package, but worries that many younger workers will never enjoy the same benefits, asking whether future workers will be able to retire at all or work until they drop dead. The article concludes by exploring the political challenge facing Democrats as they attempt to regain support from blue-collar voters who helped elect Trump in 2016 and 2024. Union leaders argue that workers need elected officials who will prioritize labor interests over corporate interests. Former union president David Green summarized that view by saying, quote, I'm a trade unionist first, adding that nobody can fix working people problems like working people, and that politicians who fail to stand with workers should be held accountable at the ballot box.